Hi, this is Teddy, and you're listening to Jessica Goodheart from Capital and Maine on Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Demcast podcast organization.
Hey everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics, which is part of the Demcast family of podcasts, and I am on today with Jessica Goodheart, who is a senior reporter at Capital in Maine. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, Kelly. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on, and we're going to talk some about a series that you're doing about inequality. But maybe to frame the conversation a little bit, could you give me some background on Capital in Maine and what you guys work on in general?
Sure. We are an online magazine based in California, and we focus a lot on stories about economic inequality, which means concretely that you'll find on our site stories about housing, about labor issues, we have business stories, and a whole range of things.
Great. And what is your background? How did you get started in this work?
That's a great question. I was a baby journalist in the 90s and wrote for a variety of publications out here in Los Angeles. And then I took a long detour. I went to grad school, studied urban planning, and worked for a nonprofit for a number of years, and then went back to journalism for sort of a second act, which is kind of an unusual trajectory.
Yeah, although a fun one, I think.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited to be doing this again. I always said, I'll get back to journalism, and in the nonprofit work that I did, I was research director at an organization called the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy that works on issues around low-wage work and community, kind of building coalitions with community organizations and unions and so on.
Excellent. Okay. And so the reason we're talking today is that Capital in Maine just last week launched a series called States of Inequality 2020 and the Great Divide. And this is going to be a year-long series, right? So tell me a little bit about sort of how this came about and what the plans are.
Sure. So the United States of Inequality is our in-depth look at economic inequality in America through the lens of the 2020 election. I'm sure your listeners know that over the past several decades, the gains from economic growth have gone to an increasingly smaller share of the population. We're at levels of inequality not seen since the Roaring '20s. And we knew that this campaign, the economy, was going to be a central issue. That we are in an economic expansion. Unemployment is low, but there are a lot of people struggling. And so we wanted to shine a light on how people were experiencing the economy in light of these kind of sort of broader structural issues. We wanted to talk about the impact of Trump administration policies on economic inequality, which obviously is a longer story. And then, obviously we have a crop of Democratic candidates who have made this issue a really burning one in the campaign, I think, in a way that we've not seen before. So we're going to have a story. We've launched last week, and so you'll find on our site a lot of content already. And then we're going to have a story a week through November 2020.
Yeah, and so tell me a little bit about the kinds of stories that are up there so far, what people can see, and then it seems like you're sort of tackling this from lots of different angles, looking at inequality in a lot of different ways. And so, what does that look like? What are the different kinds of things you're examining?
Yeah, no, good point. And I also wanted to just mention that this project is a partnership with 3 other publications. We're working with The Guardian, The American Prospect, and Fast Company, and they're going to be co-publishing some of the stories that we produce, and we're going to be running some of their content on our site. And we're in some ways competitors, but we all thought this issue is so important, and we wanted to kind of bring more resources to the topic. And so we're all working in kind of an unprecedented partnership on this story. So if you look at our site, what we have up today's story is an interview with Gabriel Zuckman, who is the economist who is the architect of Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax and also has been influential on Bernie Sanders' policies as well. And he talks about how, America's tax policies have helped fuel wealth inequality. We released a story on Joe Biden this week, which is the first in a series of stories that we'll be doing on the Democratic presidential candidates. And, he's, definitely identifies as, big union supporter. But our reporter, Robin Yurovich, takes a close look at his voting record. And, he's sort of in a battle to win endorsements from unions this time around, because he's got a lot of competition from, progressive candidates like Sanders and Warren. And also, he's been criticized for, closeness to companies that have been associated with union busting. And then there's some other, more problematic votes from the 90s, like around, say, welfare reform and the crime bill and the Bankruptcy Act that have arguably made poor people poorer and less powerful. So that's a good read that I recommend. And there's also, I took a trip to Erie, Pennsylvania, with a photographer, Joanne Kim, and that's a swing county, and talked to voters there. And one of the things I wanted to do, I had come on that's a county that narrowly voted for Trump, and it had been a Democratic stronghold for years and years. So it has been sort of under a microscope. And I had come there not long after CBS had sort of brought their trucks through and shown their cameras on the empty factories, and spent a long time with a voter who had voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. And that's a story that's been told a lot in the mainstream press. So I wanted to be sure to, I talked to talk to a broader range of folks from Erie about the election, about how they saw their own economy or their own, struggles, during the sort of this period of time. So, and I recommend that also people check out Joanne's photo essay from that trip, which is really wonderful. And we met some really interesting people. I maybe just highlight a few. One of them was really interesting, was a young woman. She's a manager at a spa. I met her in a Walmart parking lot. She was going there to move around some money so she could pay her student loans. She told me she had $250,000 in medical debt from a car accident that she had when she was in college. And, she was, a lot of people were, some of us junkies are very focused on the election and, who's in, who's out. But, she was just getting focused. But she did talk to me about how she voted last time, and I thought it was really interesting. She had voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary, and then was, kind of decided she did not want to vote for Hillary Clinton and registered as, I believe she's now an independent, and she voted for Gary Johnson. But when I talked to her about he was the libertarian candidate. When I talked to her about, her political views, they were very progressive. She was concerned about climate issues. She was concerned about health care and having stronger health care plans. So she was one of the voters that I spoke to on that trip.
So I think this is such an interesting moment in American politics that people are really focusing on inequality. We've got as we're talking, we've got this sort of hubbub that's coming up about Elizabeth Warren versus the billionaires. She just released a mug on her store that says "Billionaire Tears" on it. And it's such an interesting moment that I think so many of us for so long, especially. I grew up in the 80s and we had this sort of vision of like, oh, America, you come and, you make a lot of money and that's great. And that's a vision of success without a lot of thought of sort of who's on the other end of that. So what kind of reaction are you getting so far to this series? How are people responding to it? Are you encouraged by the response that it's getting?
Yeah, no, I mean, we really are. We're getting a lot of traction on the site, and then also our partner outlets are getting a lot of look. We've gotten, in this online business, we kind of see who's tweeting and retweeting and all that, and I've been on a few podcasts, as have other reporters who've written for this series have been on other podcasts. But I think one thing about this that I like is that this isn't just a few articles or a week. We're kind of in this for the long haul. So we're really trying to build, and what I would say, our website is www.capitalandmaine.com. I would encourage your listeners to come, visit it, sign up for the newsletter, and tweet at us and say, well, why don't you cover this, or what about this, or argue with us? I think we want this to be a conversation, and it's a year-long conversation about this topic and really our democracy. Is our democracy at this moment up to the challenge of addressing economic inequality? The first story, the cover story, which I wrote, has a story in the lead, which is this. I was in Detroit, covering just at a bar where a bunch of Democratic activists were watching one of the debates, and people were really, really engaged. There were like 200 people there. And at the very end of the evening, as people were clearing out, I sat down with a guy and I said, well, what do you think? He said, look, I'm a cook. I work here. And I don't think any of this makes any difference. Nothing's going to change, And I began with his story because I think it was a sort of gauntlet thrown down in a way to our political system. Can this trend, which we can point to the negative impacts of the 2017 tax cut and other policies of the Trump administration for sure, but this is a trend that has been decades in the making, and so this cook, Jimmy Wilson, he was really posing the question, can change be made? And I think that's sort of like at least to me, one of the overriding questions for the series.
Yeah, and so can change be made, and can people recognize the problem? I think and the fact that you're getting traction, and that the Warren and Sanders and other presidential candidates who are talking about this are getting traction seems promising to that point, because I think the there is this sort of divide, and there isn't perhaps a lot of recognition in the middle class, what has been taken from the middle class and from the poor and working class, that something has been taken, that things have changed so significantly. We see it in sort of bits and pieces. If I think about how much college cost when I went to college versus, when my kids will go, but you see it in those sort of microcosms, and instead of sort of seeing the big picture about how all of this relates to each other. So is that part of sort of the through line of this series, is sort of seeing that bigger picture through the smaller stories?
Yeah, I mean, I think the stories are part of it. I think individual stories are affecting for some people. I think that there's, research and studies are important. I think it's important to understand where public opinion is more broadly. There's this, you were talking about the cost of college, the cost of housing. I think that there is a general sense that economic mobility, it's not just economic inequality as a static thing, but economic mobility has declined. And, there's one researcher, Raj Chetty, who's done work on this, and he notes that in 1940, 90% of children would go on to make more than their parents. And 40 years later, only that was true of only half of children. And I think that's, in some ways, that just is a statistic that resonates, I think, certainly with me and with many of the stories that I have heard as I've talked to people in reporting for this. So I think there's a piece that's, I guess, consciousness raising, but I think that on some level there's a broad awareness, and certainly in the state that I live in, California, which is a very high cost state, it's a constant conversation about how difficult it's becoming. So, we want to hear those stories from different parts of the country and how people are experiencing, this shift that's taken place. I think what's also important is, I think people can sort of start to feel that it is inevitable. And one of the pieces I think it's coming out tomorrow, it is coming out tomorrow. It's an economic insecurity timeline, because a lot of this story, when people tell the story, economists tell the story, they point to kind of forces that are beyond our control, like technology, automation, globalization, as the cause for rising inequality. And, while those forces are real, there have been a lot of decisions or lack of action that have led to the place we're at right now. And so we wanted to, kind of shine a light on that as well. And so we have this timeline that's sort of our steady march towards rising economic inequality, as seen through, Supreme Court decisions, regulatory changes, major tax cuts, things that are, kind of fall between the cracks because they're not easy to understand. But, things like the in the 80s, when the Reagan Security and Exchange Commission legalized stock buybacks, and so now corporations have an incentive to really focus on short-term profits instead of reinvesting stocks in research and development in their companies. And so, there's these kinds of things that we, and obviously their employees, that we want to lift up as part of the story. So it's not just, a kind of a parade of shocking statistics, although we have those as well.
Yeah, and they are shocking. We'll make sure to tweet those out too, because they're just sort of appalling. And I think the other part of the story, and probably the part of the story that listeners to this podcast are already somewhat aware of, is the sort of dark money side of politics. So I know you have one piece out already about California's Proposition 13, and I think that's something that, especially going into 2020, people are really conscious of.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I mean, one of the things that's really starved our schools and local governments is this property tax cap, which was passed in 1978, called Proposition 13, and it was part of a wave of, it's called the tax revolt. That spread to other states across the country. And there's an effort to reform that law, and there's a big money effort to push back on the campaign to reform Proposition 13. And so we have a story about one major real estate company, the Irvine Company, that's putting money, including some dark money, into that effort on our site.
So it's going to be a challenge as I read all of these to not just turn totally eat the rich, which I must say the past few weeks of billionaires opening their mouths has sort of pushed me toward eat the rich anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just some interesting developments in the presidential campaign with the entrance of Bloomberg and at this moment in our history. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. And just wanted to make sure to mention as well that Capital in Maine is a 501c3 organization. So this is not a for-profit series that you're doing.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. We're not taking a position on any of the candidates. We are going to have articles on each one of the candidates and just talk about their track record and proposal when it comes to addressing economic inequality.
All right. So remind us again of the website and what people should do to follow along.
So our website is www.capitalandmaine.com. I'm told I don't have to say www, but I said it anyway. And it's AL capital with an A. And when you get to the website, you can sign up for our newsletter, and you can follow us that way. You can follow us on Twitter as well. And yeah, please, stay engaged. Let us know what you think, and tweet ideas as well for stories to us. We would really, really appreciate that.
Excellent. Well, Jessica, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast, and we will include on our website links to there, and we'll maybe tweet out some of the statistics and things in your video as well, so people see that they should be following along. It's a great series so far. I'm really enjoying it, and I look forward to seeing what you have to come in the next year.
Okay. Thank you, Kelly. Really, really glad to be on your show.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.